So are we all ready to get started? Yes?
Yes.
We can see that in the world today, we have a very unequal distribution of wealth in our country. This has been an issue that is talked about regularly and is something that many Americans look to. So I'm given the resolution today that the US federal government should impose a significant tax on the overall wealth of individuals. My partner and I stand firmly in the affirmation. Now, just for clarity in this round, I'd like to go over a few things. We've defined our weighing mechanism as net benefits, and all other definitions in the resolution can be seen in our plan, which is to extend the progressive tax, capping off at 50%, making it, so we currently have a progressive tax in our country that makes it so different brackets of income have different tax rates. But right now it caps off at about $400,000 a year at 39.6. So we'd be extending this progressive tax, so those making $1 million or more a year would have their tax rate increased to 50%. Yes?
Is this a wealth tax or an income tax that you're proposing?
This would be an income tax, but when we're looking at the wealth of an individual, we can see that that's defined by their income. Like, if you're not making any money, you don't really have any wealth on the whole. If we're looking to the country as a whole and making significant increases in this types of program, most people who have money in our country are currently working for large industries. This is the majority of wealthy people in our country, so it makes most sense to look to it when significantly increasing a tax in this kind of way. Which brings me on to my contentions. Our first contention has to do with the deficit. Currently, we see that our country has a major deficit, and this has been a very big problem for us, because it lowers our international standing as a whole. Many other countries around the world own our debt, and China owns quite a bit of it. When we see these other countries that have our debt, it makes it so we have less power. It makes it so they have a certain amount of power over us, because we're constantly under the fear that they could call in the debt. We can also see that when we have these sorts of programs, we make monthly payments to them. It's not as if there's just debt that occurs and it keeps building up. There are times when we have to pay them up, or have to start paying them back slowly over time. And these payments often can fluctuate. A country can suddenly say that they want a lot more money than they were previously asking because they have all of the power in this relationship. And we can see that there are many impacts of this kind of deficit. First of all, if we implemented this program, then we would have more money in our government programs overall. We'd have more money coming into the government, making it so we could decrease this deficit. The impact of this is that countries such as China would have less power over us, making it so the US would have the ability to criticize different policies they have, such as human rights and environmental. And it would also have the impact of just giving the US a better international standing on the whole to other countries. Our second contention has to do with proposed budget cuts. Under the status quo, we can see that many different senators have proposed very great cuts to our budget. Yes?
Yes. How much money would actually be created from this increase in income tax?
We can see that there'd be quite a lot. On just one individual who's making $1 million a year, we can see that their taxes would increase by about $200,000. And though that's not a huge impact on one individual, simply because of the great abundance of wealth that they have, we can see that all of these individuals coming in to the nation as a whole, it could make a significant difference to our debt and to the amount of money we would have coming in overall. But more on these budget cuts. We can see that specifically Paul Ryan has proposed many massive budget cuts. And often it's very important programs that get these slashes, such as food stamps. It's people who really need these programs. It's the programs that help the poorest in our society that often are the first to get slashed. So we can see that when we have more money coming into our government and when we have this increase of wealth coming in, then we don't have to slash these budgets. Then we have the ability to keep them where they are or increase them if our deficit decreases enough. We can see that there are many positive impacts of this. As I stated earlier, the government will have more money, meaning that the cuts can be reduced. We can see that when these cuts are reduced, then the safety net is not lost. Then we can retain this important function to American society. We can also see that when we have more money in these programs, these people have a better quality of life, which is something that we really need to look to in weighing net benefits. These people will have food on their tables, will be able to feed their family, and will have many better benefits when they can have a sustainable life, when their important programs to them aren't being slashed. Yes?
With your plan essentially cutting the salaries of these CEOs and high wealthy individuals, can you guarantee that jobs won't be lost in their respective industries to try and increase their own revenue?
Well, we can see that these cuts, like the kinds of layoffs that you're talking about, really wouldn't happen, because if we're talking about a huge corporation, like a multi-billion-dollar corporation that you mentioned, this wouldn't make a real dent in their income. It wouldn't really change their quality of life. And so they wouldn't really have a reason to. It is a significant increase, but it's not significant enough that they would suddenly lay off all of their employees because they want to make even more money. That would be very greedy of them to do in the first place. So, which brings me to my third contention, which actually does go into a lot of what you were saying, which has to do with the current wealth inequality in our country. We can see that when we have great inequalities of wealth, and when we have people on the top with significantly more money than people on the bottom, then we have many economic issues. This was seen in the Great Depression. This depression was a depression of abundance. It was that we were producing more than we could consume because the consumer basis didn't have enough money to get by. And we're seeing that we have this same problem developing in our country today. Currently, the top 1% owns 43% of our nation's wealth. The next 4% has 29%. The next 5% has 11%, with the bottom 80% of our country only having 7% of the wealth. When we see this kind of massive wealth inequality in our country, we have to act and we have to do something about it. Because when we're taxing these richer people and when we're making it so we can we have the ability to spread this wealth around. We can make it so it's going into government programs that give people the ability to consume and give them the ability to get back on their feet. And this is something huge that you have to look to. When we're having more taxes and we're getting more money into government programs, it makes it so they can have more industries that make people jobs. It makes it so they can give more money to the people at the bottom who really need it, social programs such as food stamps. Yes?
So in your plan, are you suggesting that the money taken from this income tax will be directly funneled into the incomes of lower socioeconomic people?
No, we're not. But we're saying that we're saying that in these kind of programs, when you tax these people at the top, the money goes into the government, which makes it so the government can have more programs that can fuel this kind of redistribution, such as Social Security. They can get more money into this, giving more money to these individuals and programs that we already have set up in our government today. Yes?
By how much would the proposed plan actually close this income gap?
We can't give you an exact number on that because this hasn't been done. So like economically speaking, it would be impossible to know the exact effects of this. But we do know that when we're getting more money into the government and when we're getting more money into these programs, then we have the ability to make this change. And not doing anything to solve this problem is not the solution. Just standing by and letting it get worse won't do any good. So under the world of the affirmation, we're at least attempting to make a difference. So in the end, just to go over everything one more time, our plan is to extend the progressive tax and capping it off at 50% on those making $1 million or more a year. Our first contention deals with the issues of the deficit. Our second goes over the proposed budget cuts that could really hurt the neediest people in our country. And our third goes into the inequality of wealth, showing that when we have these people at the top, consumption goes down, bringing a huge impact to our economy as a whole, making it so we can't really thrive, making it so nobody can get by when we don't have the kind of consumption, when the bottom 80% only has 7% of the wealth. So for all of these reasons, we really must affirm. Thank you.
Off-time roadmap, first going to be going on case, then be going T and off case. Okay. So first, to argue against their first point of contention where they talk about the deficit and how other countries own our debt, first off, when I asked in the POI how much would this increase actually gain the United States in terms of its wealth, they couldn't even give us a significant number. And if we look at the actual deficit that we're facing right now, it's in the trillions. Now they talk about one person of gaining about $1 million a year would have their taxes would amount to around $200,000. Now they don't even point out how much of the population itself is like even in that sort of tax bracket. So because that we can't even calculate how much it would seem that we would be getting on a yearly basis, and because that we can't really solve for this deficit issue if we're not seeing any significant numbers or any significant probability of the fact that the revenue that we're getting from this income tax would cover even the slightest amount of this deficit that we're facing. So because that, we're not really seeing any solvency coming off of that argument. But furthermore, furthermore, going on to their second argument, when they talk about the budget cuts, we can once again see that they're actually spreading themselves too thin. Once again, I point out that they never give us any significant numbers as to how much this would actually gain the United States federal government in revenue per year in terms of this increase in income tax. And so because of that, they try to put money first towards solving the deficit, but then they also try to put it towards these budget cuts and also in the third point towards decreasing the wealth discrepancy. Obviously they're spreading themselves too thin in this area. They can't put their money towards all of these different issues and actually try to solve all these different issues if they don't even know how much money is coming in. And second, if we look to the POI that my partner asked in the reference to this point, we can see that increasing the income tax on these high wealth individuals would once again only lead to increased unemployment, because we would see once again when the corporation, the owner is not getting as much money, they're more likely to fire individuals so that their own personal income can be once again raised to the level that it was before. Now they point this out as, quote, greed, but once again when we look at corporations, if their number one goal is to have revenue and to make profit, then that's what they're going to do, and they will fire employees if that's what it takes. Now with that in mind, I'll take your point of information.
Aren't there checks and balances inside a corporation to prevent that from happening?
Not really. There aren't really those sort of checks and balances within a corporation. They can fire as many of their individuals as they need to increase their own profit and to make sure that their profit margins are what they need to be. So with that in mind, I'm going to be going on to their third point, which talks about the wealth discrepancy. Now, I asked in a point of information, is this money that we take from the higher wealthy individuals going to be directly funneled into the wealth of these lower socioeconomic people? And they said that no, that doesn't happen, which means that we, once again, can see no probability of this actually leading to a decrease in the wealth discrepancy. Furthermore, they only try to funnel it into a variety of different programs. But once again, if we see that their first program, their first real goal in this plan of action is to decrease the deficit, they're not going to have extra money left to try and funnel it into these different program budgets. So they don't really get that sort of probability of solving this issue of these budget cuts and the wealth discrepancy solved through social security programs and a variety of different other programs that they point to that help people of the lower socioeconomic sectors. So because of that, you're seeing that you're not even helping in that area, but furthermore, they're actually creating a cost to those in the lower socioeconomic areas because, as I said before, they're creating higher unemployment, which is a significant cost to those who are already gaining small incomes. This is a significant cost to people who are already gaining low incomes, and now they're not even having a job available to them. So because of that, you're seeing they're not creating any benefits, but actually creating more costs. And now I would like to go on to the T argument. Now, we would like to bring up this topicality argument in terms of the definition of the wealth of individuals and the tax on the wealth of individuals. Now, they themselves try to point out the tax on the wealth of individuals as an income tax, but however, the definition of a tax on the wealth of individuals is an asset tax, a tax on the sort of property that it owns. Things such as real estate, artwork, cars, and all these sort of things are a tax on assets. However, they try to increase the tax on income. That is not a wealth tax. That is an income tax, and that's why it's called an income tax. So with that in mind, you're seeing they're violating this the definition of a wealth on individuals in our own definition that is generally accepted amongst the accounting community. And because of that, they're not upholding the standards of creating a fairness for this round to have an actual debate about about having an increased significant tax on the wealth of individuals. And because that, they're significantly harming us as the negation team to go ahead and try and debate this, debate them on the income tax when we come to this round prepared to debate about the wealth of individuals, which is about asset tax, not income tax. So with that in mind, I'm going to go on to our own three offensive arguments, first being that of capital flag. Now, if we want to look at empirical arguments of how this sort of wealth tax has affected companies or affected the actual countries, we can look at France, which had a significant decrease in loss in innovation, as well as adverse effects in their home interest rates. So if we want to look at France, what they did is they decided to increase the tax on the wealth of individuals by at least 75%. And in that area, and in France itself, a lot of people who are in the wealthier sectors, they decided to move out of the country because they didn't want to face that sort of taxation on their wealth and on their assets. So because of that, they saw a significant loss in innovation because a lot of those people who were wealthier individuals were people who owned companies, who had a lot of innovation that led to their own wealth. And as they were moving out of the country, moving out of the country itself lost that sort of innovation. They were seeing a lot of brain drain in that area. So because there's lots of innovation and loss of corporate significance in that area, there was actually a loss of jobs, which is once again leading to higher unemployment. And also, as I pointed out before, there was adverse effects on their home interest rates, which went up at least 11% because banks were seeing that their higher socioeconomic patrons were leaving the country, so they needed to have more assurance that those people who are now buying homes would be able to pay up their mortgage more quickly and upfront. So because of that, they increased their home interest rates. And apart from that, they saw a huge recession because they only gained $2.6 million from this increase on the tax of assets, but they saw a loss of actually $125 million in terms of the lost innovation, the lost jobs, and the loss in the home and the real estate sector. Now, second, of course, is the fact that this is not a recycling, or the tax on assets is not a recycling gain. Now, if we want to look at the tax on assets, which is things like your mortgage and other pieces of artwork, for example, that you would own, these are not things that are recycled yearly or monthly like an income tax is. So because of that, each time you take out money from this, you're not really recycling the amount of money that is left to take from. So because of this, you're not seeing a significant benefit in that area, and you should be voting for the negation. Thank you.
I'm going to start off on T, then go F, then neg. Okay, cool. Okay. So, are my opponents ready? Ready? Are the judges ready? Okay. So, going directly into the T on the discrepancy over the definition of wealth of individuals and taxing the wealth of individuals. Their standard being, or their interpretation being that tax on wealth has to be an asset tax. Well, as my partner said in the very beginning when she was justifying the definition, wealth is defined by your income, right? Like wealthy people have higher incomes. This is a pretty logical interpretation. Furthermore, as far as fairness and debate goes, this is a well-known debate on taxing the rich. So when you talk about fairness, talking about what people are prepared to debate and prepared to judge and prepared to understand, it's much easier and more educational to come to a conclusion over income tax rather than wealthy tax on asset. Yes?
Does the resolution itself state the overall wealth of individuals?
Yeah, it does. So the overall wealth is defined by the amount of income they're getting, right? And it doesn't say asset tax or income tax, and that's up to the interpretation of the affirmation. Now the affirmation believes that we've interpreted in a way that would be fair and educational. It's fair because first you have an understanding of this. This has been in the news lately. This has been a debate that's gone on for years. And it's educational because since we know about this, we can talk about this to a greater degree. Like how many times have people talked about capital flight in France versus how many times have we talked about budget cuts, taxing the rich, Mitt Romney. This was all parts of the last election. So when you want to talk about the impact on the round and how you would vote, you can even RBI this, that they'd even put theory into this in the first place because it's a pretty logical and easy interpretation to go on. So you can drop the T. Okay, on to the affirmation. Our first contention was on the deficit, China owning wealth. There was a lot of impact about international power and monthly payments, things like that. Okay, so overall, actually, on this rebuttal and in other rebuttals, you'll see that there's a question of how much money are we even making? Well, my partner talked about this in the third contention in a warrant, on how 80% of the United States makes 7% of the money. So when we're talking about wealth, a lot of people have a lot of money. So 50% of someone who's making $1 billion a year's income is $500 million. Now if we have even like 30 people like that, which, you know, there's thousands in the United States, but even 30 people like that is a significant dent on our debt. So even though we can't bring cards into this because this is parliamentary debate, we can look to the fact that even 30 people is a significant enough debt to monthly payments, to, you know, other things that would lead to the impacts that we were talking about. By even bringing down the deficit a little bit, by paying off these debts in a better way, what we have is more security. And as the impacts in the other contentions talk about, more government financial security leads to better programs, things like that. So you can drop that refutation that they talked about. Okay, on to the second contention, which is, again, the same question. How much money exactly is coming in? Now here we can differentiate something. Just because money's coming in doesn't mean like we have to make this choice on, oh, do we take it to the deficit or do we take it to programs? It's up to the government. More money means all of these things. So they can be both paying off the deficit and running programs, or they could prioritize getting the deficit to be smaller at first and then going into other programs. The point of our advocacy is not to where the money could go, but where the money could go. We don't need to prove to you where it would go. We don't need to say we would take all this money and put it somewhere else. Our fiat power, like what the resolution gives us, is to tax. And if we are taxing, that's what our advocacy is. Our advocacy isn't saying, and then take the money and put it somewhere else. That'd be extending our powers too far. However, we can do both of these things. Let's look to long-term benefits. If we can solve the deficit in the next 10 years because of this tax, after that, these programs would be aided over the years. Yes?
So which is the biggest priority, solving the deficit or giving the money towards program which help the lower socioeconomic sector?
So we don't have to decide that, and we don't need to prove that to you. However, the deficit would be the short-term benefit. We need to get rid of the deficit so we don't pay these monthly payments as high as they are right now because those could balloon and go crazy. However, you know, that's up to the government to decide. Right now, our advocacy is to tax so that we have this money to solve this problem. But we can look at multiple solvencies here. Like, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive, right? In the short term, getting rid of the deficit and paying off these monthly payments is important. But in the long term, these social programs are also important. And they don't have to be exclusive the way we're making it out to be. We can take half of the money and put it in one place, half the money and put it in another place. Basically, what we're advocating is getting the money, government more money in this way. Okay, so you can extend the first two contentions. The third contention on current wealth inequality and how that impacts. Actually, let's just go into the impacts of the second contention really quick. When it comes to social programs, we can talk about education. We can talk about health. We can talk about quality of life. Better educated citizens means better voters, which means better democracy, things like that. There's also all sorts of positive impacts that come with a government that has the money to do positive things in the social realm. So all those impacts are coming off of the second contention. furthermore in the international impacts. Okay, the third contention was on current wealth inequality. Their rebuttal here was that unemployment would go up. We need to differentiate real quick between revenue and salary. Like, the top CEOs would be making a salary and they would be paying more in taxes, sure. But the industry's revenue would be the same. And in a business, you have a board of directors, especially these big businesses they're talking about, right? So the people who would make these big unemployment decisions wouldn't see the effect of this revenue shift because the revenue would be exactly the same. Instead, what we'd see is like a CEO would be paying more in taxes. Now, it's not within the power of a CEO to fire people because they're paying more taxes. Unemployment decisions are made, firing people decisions are made by boards of directors who would still see the exact same revenue coming off of this. And then they said there's no probability that they would go to the lower class, and my partner linked to it after that POI, saying, well, Social Security and other programs help people pay. So if you're able to afford more food, one, that's higher quality of life, and two, that's money that you could be spending, consumer spending, positive economy. Positive economy means more employment. So those are two themes that you're going to see on all those rebuttals. Okay, on to the negations case. Now the negations case is under their own definitions, but if you want to look to the advocacy we're talking about, neither of these problems would happen. Right? We're advocating a higher income tax for people over millionaires. So the first contention about capital flight would not happen because we wouldn't be doing an asset tax in the first place. And secondly, the fact that these things aren't recycled, again, that's not a problem in the advocacy. So once you've dropped the T, these two disadvantages fall. So overall, we can see that our advocacy is perfectly fine, and it solves for a lot of impacts. That's topical because the wealth of an individual is how much money they are making, and it's also more effective than what an asset tax would be. And because it's fair and educational, I urge you to vote on the affirmation in this resolution. Thank you.
Okay, so for an off-time roadmap, I'll be going over T, then addressing the affirmative team's case, and then going on to our own negation points. So first off, to address the idea of T, we're essentially stating that the affirmative team did a very abusive definition by essentially ignoring the resolution and what the wording of the resolution actually states. It said that the United States federal government should impose a significant tax on the overall wealth of individuals. We see that the overall wealth of individuals is defined in their overall assets. They try and twist this definition and try and put it towards the income tax, but not only is that not defined by the overall wealth of an individual, but it's solely their income tax, and this income is not essentially their overall wealth. We can see that the overall wealth is something that is actually topical in this debate today because it is imposed in numerous other countries around the world through wealth tax, and that's what we as the negation team believe that should be interpreted in this debate today. So we urge you to vote on the idea of fairness and actually having a debate on the resolution that the overall wealth of individuals is defined as the overall wealth tax. I'll take your PR.
Do you understand the issue of income inequality, and did you argue it under our definitions?
What we're essentially stating is that you presented a plan and we're showing that that plan doesn't work, but then you also misinterpreted the resolution that even if, we're also going to show you when I refute your refutations made towards our own negation case, that it can also be cross-applied to your income tax arguments that you also make. So now, go on to the affirmative team's case. The affirmative team's case essentially starts off with the deficit argument. They say that they're trying to decrease the deficit, and in inherently doing so, it lowers the international debt, and that countries have our debt right now, and that right now they have an increased fluctuation. Their plan solves because the United States is not tied internationally. Now, in response to this, my partners pointed out that essentially this $13 deficit within the status quo would not be solved with their plan. They can't really give any significant figures of how much money would actually be needed to solve the problem of the deficit. They can't really show that their plan actually solves this problem. Now, also look towards the fact that they point out, they try and bring up an example that many people would have nearly a $500 million tax on their own income. We can actually turn this point and actually look towards our capital flight argument. We bring in the fact that essentially this links to our capital flight argument because people would want to leave due to this significantly high income tax. Nearly 50% of their income can actually cause people to leave the United States because this is a significantly high tax. And this overall decreases the amount of innovation within our country, as my partner pointed out within our capital flight argument. And we can actually understand that this high income tax would have a negative impact on the people because the people would want to leave the country to avoid this high income tax, and not this time. So then also look towards their second contention, where they bring up the idea of budget cuts and how their plan would essentially solve for the budget cut argument. We can actually see, again, that they provide no numbers, and they actually don't show how they can channel this wealth. But in response to that, to simply state that the United States federal government has the ability to choose in which way they funnel this money, but this doesn't show how it is affected. They can't show how the money that they get would actually be affected if the United States federal government is able to choose whichever way they can. They can't get all of these impacts if they simply said that the United States federal government is going to be able to choose which route it takes. So therefore, they can't get all of these impacts of a decrease in the deficit, a decrease in the budget cuts, or a decrease in wealth inequality. We can actually see that the United States federal government, because it has the ability to choose so, does not have to take necessarily all three of these routes, and because of this, they don't actually show where this money would actually be put towards. So actually look towards this. Also understand that in response, when we brought up the point in the link that companies would actually fire people to increase their revenue and increase their overall salary, the affirmative team simply stated that companies wouldn't be that greedy. But really understand that companies want to have the best overall salary and have the best amount of income, and they essentially want to have the most amount of money that they can. And because of this and the fact that they want money, they would be willing to risk unemployment and essentially cut people out of their company to try and increase their own salaries and increase their own company's revenue. Because we can also link towards the fact that this has also caused an increase in the amount of prices for companies and essentially the products that they produce. Because the people in the top who are getting their salaries decreased will want to compensate for that in other areas and therefore raise the prices of their own commodities, which could have an adverse effect on the people within the United States. Because an increase in the amount of quality and the amount of prices within their products could actually hurt those poor people within the 80% that they point out within their own case. So because of this, you can turn this argument and see that an increase in the income tax would actually have an adverse effect on those in the 80% because it could have an increase in unemployment and also cause an increased amount of prices and commodities within the United States economy. I'll take your point.
Is it within our fiat power to specify where the money goes?
You actually do have the ability to essentially show where this money could actually go, because a tax has to have some sort of funnel, and actually showing where this funnel goes is an important part to how solvent your plan is. Because you don't show any solvency that your plan actually has, you can't claim any of the impacts that you bring up. Now go on to the third contention, where they bring up the idea of wealth inequality. You can again turn this point by saying that again, the CEOs and these people in the top companies who are seeing their salaries essentially decrease and their income decrease would want to compensate for that in other areas. The affirmative team tries to turn this by saying that salary is not equal to revenue, but understand that the CEOs want to have the overall highest salary that they can. And in order to have this amount and have this high amount, they want to essentially cut in other areas. And in order to do this, it could cause an increase in unemployment and also cause an increase in the amount of prices within their own company. Now, go on to the negation case and the points that we bring you. We define this resolution essentially looking at an overall wealth tax, but even if you don't buy that argument, you can still apply these contentions over to the idea of a significantly large income tax. Understand that the plan that they bring you is a 50% tax on these people's overall income over a certain income value. But essentially understand that this significantly high income of over 50% is significantly damaging because it can actually have adverse effects. Look towards the capital flight argument. When you look towards the fact that other countries, we give you the nation of France, when they saw simply a wealth tax on their overall wealth, this actually saw people move out of the country and go to other places to try and make sure that their wealth was not taxed. But also link into the fact of an income tax. This could actually cause companies to move out of the United States into other different nations around the world, such as Mexico, such as China, which don't have these expenditures in place, and such that this tax wouldn't be as high in these other nations. This could cause a decrease in that flow of jobs outside of the United States, which is essentially turning their argument of a more increase in jobs and essentially having more decrease in the amount of the wealth inequality, because this could actually cause a more job loss within the United States because companies move out of the United States and to try and decrease their overall income tax. Now also, you can also look towards our second contention, where we say that the wealth tax is not recycled, and you can again turn this towards the income tax argument that they bring up, because we see that having a 50% increase on their tax doesn't actually solve the problem. We try and point this out again and again, showing that they're 50%, they just set it at an arbitrary limit, but they don't show how exactly this money would have a strong impact on the economy. They try to make very vague general arguments stating that this money could be used here, could be used here, could be used here, but we don't really have the advocacy to show how it could be used. But there's where they lose their solvency. They don't actually show where this tax money actually goes. Because they don't show how this tax money actually solves any of these problems, you can't be voting for them off of these issues. So essentially when you look towards that, you can see that their income tax really isn't having an impact on the economy, and therefore isn't being recycled and having an absolute benefit, because they don't prove the link is how to actually, it has a solvency in this debate. So because of this, you should essentially be voting on the negation team, because they don't provide you the links, and also they choose a very abusive definition of the resolution that doesn't actually apply to this debate today. It's choosing to define this debate as essentially the overall wealth of individuals as simply the income tax doesn't work, because it's not what the overall wealth of an individual is defined as. The overall wealth of an individual is defined as their assets, as defined by a wealth tax, not defined by a simple income tax, which can change from month to month or change from year to year, which therefore is not the overall wealth of an individual. So for these reasons, I urge the strongest vote in the negation.
Everyone's ready? So as the last negative speaker, I'm just going to be giving to the voters and why it is you're going to be weighing in the favor of the negation, especially with relation to the weighing mechanism of cost-benefit. But first, I would like to talk, of course, about the topicality argument. Now, the topicality argument is one based on the idea of the interpretation of how it is generally interpreted within the accounting community, where wealth tax is a tax on assets. Now, if we want to look at the discrepancy between the income tax and the tax on overall wealth of individuals, we can look at the idea that a lot of people who have a very large wealth actually have no income. Now, the idea behind this is the fact that people gain a lot of money because they create a business and then they sell that business elsewhere and then they retire. But still, they have a lot of income, or it's not income, they have still a lot of assets in the fact that they have saved up a lot of money, but year to year, they have no income because they're not still working for that company. But still, we can see they have a lot of assets, they have a lot of saved up wealth, and the people in this sector who make a large, who make up a large percentage and large portion of those wealthy individuals within the United States, those who are in like the top 5%, those who are in the top 7%, those people are not under the jurisdiction of the affirmation plan. And because that, once you can see that, one, they're not even creating a solvency on that plan because they're not hitting these people who have a lot of wealth but aren't getting, but don't have a lot of income. But second, of course, you can see that they're still linking into this idea of them being very abusive in their definition because they don't rely on the generally accepted definition of an overall wealth of an individual, which when looking internationally at how it's been defined, when we look at France, for example, we can see that it is an asset tax, not an income tax. So with that in mind, I will just go on to talk about the other voter issues in this debate. So first, the fact of capital flag. Now, as we said before, when specifically talking about this asset tax and also in relation to income tax, when we increase the income tax to 50%, as I want to propose for those over the $400,000 mark, as I think they specified it, then we can see that this will be a significant loss to a lot of people within the United States in terms of their income. And because of that, people would be people would be really interested in leaving the United States because they can see that they are not getting as much of an income as they saw before. And because of that, because we're seeing so many people just leaving the United States because of this significantly detrimental income tax, they're moving to other places like my partner specified, Mexico, China, who don't have that sort of high income tax. And so we're seeing a significant brain drain, which, as I said before, is linked to a loss of innovation and once again linked to a loss of jobs, which is a turn on their argument where they talk about this wealth discrepancy and they talk about how it's supposed to help those people in the lower socioeconomic sectors. It's actually harming people in the lower socioeconomic sectors because there are less jobs available to them. So with that in mind, I'll take your point of information.
Even if taxes are slightly higher, don't most people want to live in a developed country, unlike Mexico and China?
Aren't there a lot of developed countries that don't have wealth or income taxes such as this? And because that, people can move from one developed country like the United States to a developed country, for example, like we see in a lot of European countries who have developments but they don't have that sort of income tax that is so very high. And so we can still see a significant brain drain happening in that area. And apart from that, we saw that once again in France specifically, when they implemented this form of tax, there was an increase in the home interest rates, which was a significant detriment to the real estate sector. And apart from that, there was also a recession created because the amount of money that they gained did not at all equate to the amount of money that they lost. And with that in mind, when we actually look at their impacts when they talk about the budget and the deficit, we can see that they don't solve for these things for a variety of reasons. One is the fact that, as I said before, they are not gaining as much money as they lose from the loss of jobs and from the loss of innovation and from this brain drain. So they don't solve for that, but they actually create more of a harm. And second is, of course, the fact that they try to spread their money too thin. Now, they say that we can choose one, but if they never provide to you which one they are choosing, they can't really gain a benefit out of all of these things. Now, they can either claim, they can try to make the distinction and claim either we're going to be solving for the deficit, we're going to be solving for budget cuts, or we're going to be solving for wealth discrepancy, but they cannot claim all three advantages because they themselves say they will choose one to look at. So with that in mind, you can't be giving all three of these advantages to the affirmation case when they themselves say the government will choose one. So they themselves need to choose one that they want to claim and not try to spread themselves so thin and lose all their advantages in that way. And second, of course, is the fact when we look at their own case, we are seeing a significant lack of solvency. First, of course, as I said before, they try to gain all these advantages and spread themselves too thin. But second, of course, the fact that when they try to implement this plan, they actually have an adverse effect on the corporations and on those people who work for the corporations because they're not getting any benefit. In fact, they're seeing significant harms to the amount of employment that is available. They're seeing significant harms to the corporations, and they try to come here and claim that corporations won't fire people because of the loss of salary. But that is what we generally see in corporate corporate law, or not in corporate law, in corporate history, when there is a significant loss in revenue or salary, people lose jobs. So because of that, you're voting for the negation.
Okay, is everyone ready? And I apologize in advance, I have a lot to get through in this speech, so I'm sorry if I'm not going to be able to take your questions, but I will try. Okay, so is everyone ready? I'd first like to start by going over their voting issues and saying why they're incorrect, and then going over ours. The first voting issue had to do with capital flight, but this is something that we see wouldn't really be affected. First of all, businesses are different. They're talking about this innovation being drained away, but we're not talking about taxing the revenue of a company. We're talking about taxing the income of an individual, so that's very different. We can also see that we've done nothing to affect the capital gains tax, which is the main tax that affects business, because it's people who are investing in businesses that end up making this money for the businesses. Investment is really big, and we're not affecting the capital gains tax at all. We're just talking about these income taxes, making this point irrelevant. There's also something that I've been started to talk about in a point of order. Or a lot of the things that they're talking about isn't correct. A lot of what they're saying about this brain drain would happen from the US, it wouldn't occur, because the US has some of the lowest taxes in the developed world, even if we had this kind of program. Because the US has capital system and a lot of the other developed world having socialistic systems, we can still see that our taxes are lower. So yes, people moved away from France, but a lot of them probably moved to the US for the lower taxes. People in the US wouldn't suddenly want to move to China or Mexico because they're less developed countries and they're worse on the whole, so there's no reason why they would want to move away from a good country just because they have to pay slightly higher taxes. This is simply silly. Nobody is that greedy to want to lower their quality of life to that degree. So the second voting issue had to do with solvency. They said that jobs lost, but as we said, that wouldn't happen because we're not affecting the revenues of a company. We're simply affecting the incomes of the CEOs, and they would have no real reason to try to, they'd have no justification by firing these people just because they're making a little less money, just because they have to be taxed a little bit more. It's simply silly because they have the board of directors that has to be involved in these mass firings that they're talking about, and that simply wouldn't happen. These mass firings couldn't happen because they would have no justification when they're talking to the board of directors and such. We can also see that if we're looking to long-term, that AF actually does have solvency and much more than the NEG does. The NEG doesn't really have any solvency. They just say that everything the AF is doing is bad. So we can, I'll go into that more in my voting issues though. Yes, and take the question.
You stated that they'd just be losing a small portion of their wealth, but isn't 50% a pretty significant number?
It is a significant number, and we are raising the taxes significantly, but we're going from 39.6 to 50%, so it's not enough to suddenly make somebody want to leave the country and to suddenly want to just restart their lives entirely. As I stated in my first speech, the tax right now is 39.6, we're raising it up to 50, so it's a significant increase, but not significant enough that everyone would suddenly decide to leave the country forever. So now going on to our voting issues. Our first is a reverse voting issue with their topicality show. We can see that in the end this ended up decreasing the quality of debate because all of their points they end up turning to work under our definitions, therefore they had no real reason to change it. They said it wasn't as fair, but again, they argued under our definitions, and they argued just fine under their definitions. There was clearly ground for both sides, making it so the entire shell just decreased the education of debate and made it so we have to waste our time on this issue. So I'm not going to waste any more time on that issue, and I'm going to move on to my second voting issue, which has to do with solvency. We can see that we solved for deficit cuts, wealth inequality, and cuts to our system in the whole. The NEG doesn't even attempt to solve for anything. The AF has many long-term benefits. As we said, we want to start out by solving the deficit, then over time we can make it so these cuts don't have to happen. We can make it so we fix this inequality of wealth. When we're looking to net benefits, we have to look to long-term, and if we had all this money coming into our government and constantly coming into our government, then in the long term we could do a lot of good if we had this increased revenue. And this is something that the NEG doesn't really look to at all. We can also see that in our if you even believe that one of these things is true, if you believe that we could cut the deficit, or that we could make these or that we could decrease budget cuts, or that we could solve this wealth inequality, then you should vote AF, because that's an impact that the negation does not give you. They don't solve for any of these issues. So if the affirmation can even solve for one of them, then that's a vote in the favor of the affirmation. Going on to our second voting issue, which has to do with income. First of all, we just like to very clarify that we're taxing income, not revenue of a company. And because this revenue is not being taxed, then the company would not have these reasons for this mass firing, because the company itself would be making the same amount of money, the CEO would just be taxed slightly higher. The company's revenue would not be affected, giving no justifications to the CEOs to have these mass firings. They can't simply say, I want to fire everybody so because I have to pay high taxes. That's simply silly and absurd. Companies can't work if they fire all of these people. If their revenue isn't being affected, if the company is still being effective, they're not just going to fire people and make their company less effective. That's simply absurd of them to say in the first place. We can also see in their issue of capital flight, it's irrelevant, because again, capital gains and revenue are still unaffected. So these innovators would want to be in the US still. They'd want to be in the country that's best at innovation. They'd want to be in this country where we do have good business laws, where you can invest in capital gains, and where we're not really taxing your business revenue that much, where we're taxing your income. So these are huge differences that make it so capital flight is really irrelevant under this argument, because people would not have a reason to leave. And again, they don't really have any roles to go, because the rest of the developed world has even higher taxes than the US. Even with this increase, the US still has lower taxes than most of the developed world. The countries that they talk about, like China and Mexico, no millionaire is suddenly going to want to move to Mexico because they're paying slightly higher taxes. That's simply silly. They wouldn't want to go to a worse country. Our fourth voting issue has to do with impacts. And overall, you can see that the affirmation tries to solve for these problems. We have real-world impacts, and we've disproven all of theirs, meaning that they have nothing. They don't even try to solve for any of the problems we have under the status quo. They said that our solvency might not be efficient. But first of all, you prove that it is, because if we long term we can solve for all of these, and in the short term, if we can even solve for one, then that's a vote for the affirmation. We try to solve the deficit cuts, and we try to solve for this wealth inequality. The negation doesn't even try. They just say that the status quo was fine, which isn't okay. We have these issues under the status quo, and the fact that the affirmation tries to solve for them gives us more impact than the negation could have. So for all of these reasons, you really must affirm. Thank you.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Can they make new refutations in their closing speeches? I know they can't make new arguments, but can they make?
If they're
They bring new
responding to
evidence
an
or
argument
new-
that was first brought up in the block, then yes. But if you think that argument was brought up before, then no. Does that make sense?
So they can
Like,
bring.
if the neg makes a completely new argument in the block,
Yeah.
then the app can only respond to
Right,
it. But
in that last
otherwise,
speech.
no.
Okay.
Good job.
I think I've decided, so whenever you're ready.
Okay, give me 1 minute. Okay. Let me get started too.
Cool. Do you want to go first?
Sure. Okay. Great speaking on everyone's part. You guys are all very good speakers. So a few things. You guys should establish harms. So your general formatting should be definition, like criterion, definitions, harms, and then contentions. So it doesn't have to be long, but you should be like, we have poverty in this country, started on below this rate, we have this huge wealth gap, like, these are our harms. We have this deficit reduction, we owe China all this money, therefore they have all this power over us, that's bad. Like, so you just need to lay out your harms a little bit better. You guys do get to them in your contentions, but better debaters put their harms first instead of including them in their arguments, because you can always refer back to them, and then oftentimes there is a debate on whether or not those things are harms. You know, they'd be like, I don't think it's a problem that we have poverty. Like, you know. Okay, so next, I would say that everyone needs to be better at taglining and making your impact your tagline. So, like, you gave me this really long thing, and then at the end you said they have no solvency. Good. I've done debate for many years. Start with no solvency, then go into why. Like, because honestly, I'm just going to write down no solvency, and I probably already know why. Like, you don't even necessarily need to explain it to me. So, that's key. Also, you said you were going to run on case and then off case, but you did off case and then on case. It's fine. Like, it's not that big of a deal. But, and I would run your T first,
Yes.
honestly. Yeah. Okay, so second speakers. You made a great argument, but it's like, most people probably missed it, and it's actually the argument I'm going to vote on. Like, but you did not tagline it, you did not name it as a contention. It's like a small one-sentence thing that you threw in there, which is that if the money goes to the poor, even just some of it, then consumer spending is going to increase. Like, okay, that's huge in economics. All we do is talk about consumer spending most of the time. So I'm sure you guys missed it because it was a really small one-sentence thing in his speech. You still have to catch those, even if they aren't, you know, taglined as arguments and stuff like that. But yeah, that's your biggest argument, which you guys did not impact at all, except to say increased growth. Like, but it's actually what I'm going to end up voting on. They're right. Okay, good job on the mutual exclusivity thing of, like, you guys can't, the deficit reduction is huge, the budget is huge, the wealth gap is huge, so you're going to have to solve, you can solve one of these, but you can't solve all of these. If I were you guys, I would have said, we're going to increase this tax, and it's going to be offset by a tax rebate for the poor, like, and then just get rid of the deficit reduction thing, because you would have to know a lot more about soft power to fully impact out the China argument for me to vote on it, because just less power by China, like on us, is not impacted out well enough. But if you guys had made it like, we're just gonna focus on like giving this more money to like the poor basically, then you can still capture your wealth gap thing, and you've said exactly where the money is going to go, and you can cut them off on all these like mutual, like you can only solve one of these contentions. The big one that you guys just add that I wanted to hear from you is loopholes, right? Like, we already have a 39.6% tax on the rich. What does Romney pay? Like 12%. He had to donate millions just to get to 14 in the election, right? So even if you increase this tax, like, unless you do things to fix all the tax loopholes, like, you're actually not going to see any solvency on this, right? So that was like one really big one I wanted to hear. You guys have no idea what you're talking about with unemployment, but that's okay. We'll strike that from the record. Okay, your last speech was really good. It should have come in his speech, almost all of those conditions. The income isn't revenue, like, because, right, like companies are going to operate differently than just rich individuals who own money. So, and the argument that the US already has super low taxes, so where are you going to move? Like, to Europe? Like, yeah, of course that happened in France, because they were, like, really high to begin with, like, but US has really low taxes, so, and there's lots of other reasons why you keep your company in the United States, like, so, but that argument comes way too late, way too late. And your argument about the fact, like, capital gains tax is also different, also coming too late. Your T argument, if you had made it, provide an alternative to, I think T arguments are far more convincing when you say, well, you should have done this instead. Like, this would have been fairer and better, and like, you guys could have said capital gains, you could have picked another wealth indicator, but your thing about, like, and you're right, that wealthy people keep all their money in investments, right? They most, like, lots of them work for nothing and take stock options. So, that's your other big, like, solvency point there too, but, you have to make, you could either say like, awesome, because you guys aren't doing cap DAG, so you have like no solvency, right? Because like rich people put their money in more investment. Or you can say that this should have been a cap gains because that's actually wealth, and then, but you need to make a way better argument about why income isn't wealth, because income is a form of wealth, like, and I did not understand your second argument, and you guys did not put impacts on it. So if you are going to make that, it needs to have way better impacts.
Alright.
Got any feedback for them?
Yeah, sure. Alright, so starting in the deficit argument, I agree, it's very underexplained, and also probably just like wrong. And debaters say this a lot, so I'll just say this now on video. Guys, stop saying that argument. So, like, China can't just call back our debt. Like, that's not how it works, right? Treasury bonds have a, like,
they would
maturity.
Liquidate it and sell it off. That's the potential harm.
Sure, but like yeah, they could, but like.
But they're not going to.
And they're not going to, because that would collapse their own economy.
Yeah.
And as the saying goes, if you owe the banker $100, you're in trouble. If you owe the banker $100 million, the banker is in trouble. So there's no reason for China to just randomly like collapse the world economy for no reason. But even like, and they can't call back the debt because every treasury bond has like a date on it when you have to pay it back. And they can't just show up like 10 years earlier and be like, we want the money back. That's not how it works. And also, like, we have nukes, so they can't really force us.
And even if they didn't have all this debt on us, it doesn't mean that things with China are just going to go really well then. Like, that all of our negotiations are going to be so much easier now that they don't have this huge debt. Like, it probably, soft power-wise, it's still going to be a bitch to work with China, so.
Yeah, I just think it's a bad argument, and people should not be running it.
I hear it all the time, so.
Yes. In terms of mutual exclusivity, like, I can definitely see why you would be running a problem because you're afraid that you can't fiat where the money would go. And to some extent it's true, like you can't fiat, but that doesn't mean that you can't make arguments for where it will go, right? So you can just say, like, given the current political situation, we think that it will go into Social Security. Actually, it can't go into Social Security because that's funded by payroll taxes. But we'll think it will go to food stamps, right? We just think, like, there's a lot of political support behind food stamps right now, so we think that's where it'll go.
Okay.
That just because you can't fiat something doesn't mean you can't make arguments about what will happen.
Okay.
And I think Kate is right. Like, you should decide where it will go. Otherwise, your impacts are kind of flimsy.
Okay.
Okay, so that's.
And if they tried to run T and be like, it doesn't say that you can say where the money is gonna go, and you could be like, just argue on educational standards, that like, having this hypothetical, we have money, it can go to anything, is way less educational than.
Yeah.
Okay.
So you can defend yourself on theory, but if you don't want to, like, if you don't want to even have the theory debate, there's a difference between fiating, saying money will go to food stamps, and saying we fiat will have money, and then we just think that it will go to food stamps because, like, status quo wise, that's where the political forces are. Do you see the difference?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, now let's talk about, like, different kinds of taxes. I think that you guys are all very confused about different kinds of taxes.
Yeah.
So there's 4 specifically that you should know. Okay, so first of all, just standard income tax, right? That's the one that's currently capped at like 39%.
Yeah.
That's taxes on basically like your wages and salaries, just very straightforward, or like self-employment income.
Arnold,
Yeah.
do you want to give them more than like 6 speaker points?
Oh, sorry, I forgot that.
It's on a 30-point scale.
Yeah,
Sure.
yes,
I thought that's what you meant, but
yes. Sorry about that. Payroll taxes are taxes that go into Social Security. So if you want to increase funding to Social Security, you should increase payroll taxes.
Okay.
Payroll taxes are flat, unlike actually slightly regressive, unlike income taxes. But so that's actually, so there's 5. Then capital gain taxes are taxes on the increase of the various capital stocks you own. Like if you have stocks, stocks go up in value, you have a gain in your capital, so you pay tax on that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And corporate taxes are taxes that corporations pay. So increase in capital gains taxes is not going to affect companies that much. Increase in payroll taxes will not affect companies that much. Increase in, or at least not directly, and increase in income taxes. If you want to directly take money from corporations, you have corporate taxes, right? So that's 4. All of these are taxes on like some sort of income, like income used generally as
Some increase in money.
increase, like a money flow, right? A wealth tax, as they correctly point out, is a tax on like how much money you have, period.
Think about it as like, wealth is the sum and income is the flow, like, of money.
Right. So I think it's generally true that if people who have higher incomes also happen to have higher wealth, like sure, but that doesn't mean these are the same thing. I think that you guys do a fairly decent job explaining the difference. So for me, just because like the 2 things happen to be correlated doesn't mean that increasing income taxes is increasing wealth taxes.
Okay.
Especially because like wealth tax is just a term of art. Like wealth tax is a tax on wealth. Wealth does not have to be like art paintings. Wealth can just be cash. Like any like that's why it says overall wealth. If you have cash, if you have a house, if you have like a Picasso painting, that's wealth, and you pay a tax on that. And so, with that topicality, I'll talk. But like I think that I'll talk a little bit about how the technicalities of the topicality works. But just in terms of like who is right, you're right, and you're wrong. Like it's not wealth tax. So let's talk a little bit about the NC. There, you guys seem to be wanting to run arguments that would originally function under the wealth tax and then later try to cross-apply them to the income tax. But ironically enough, you messed up twice and it ended up canceling each other out. Because the 75% tax in France that you're referring to is an income tax. Actually, if we had 75% tax on wealth, that'd be insane. France does have a tax on wealth, but it's like 2%. Because if you took 75% of like everybody's wealth every year, that would be, yeah, that would be just crazy.
How do they do the 2%?
Huh?
How do they do the 2% wealth? They like find ways of
They just,
measuring
yeah, I mean,
Their
France has
sub-wealth.
very good records
Okay.
of everyone's,
personal wealth.
yeah.
Yeah.
Going back to the French Revolution, they just rounded up all the rich people and started counting them.
I was gonna say, I was like, that does sound like the historical.
Yeah, so France actually does have a wealth tax, and then when you guys start talking about France, it's like, oh, they did the research. But then your tax here is an income tax, which originally is a huge mistake, but then because you're trying to cross-apply, I was like, actually, that cross-application works really well, because it is an income tax. And so, for me, I'm looking at the tea debate first, obviously. And there, I think that both sides are not doing enough work. Like, just, it's an issue that can potentially win or lose the round, and I think that you guys are very significantly undercovering it. So you attempt to give it some sort of a shell structure in your first speech, but like fairness is not a standard. Fairness is a voter, right? You need to have some standard leading up to fairness, like dictionary or literature if you talk about accountants, or predictability, or anything that leads up to fairness, right? Instead, you just kind of smush fairness and standards and voters together. And then in your speech, you don't even, like, you don't extend it as a shell, you just sort of talk about it, which is a problem because at this point, he's definitely not like a voter in a theory sense, right? It's not like they were unfair, so I should drop them. That was not articulated. But also because it's not a voter, it also can't really be an RBI, right? Because like the logic of RBIs is that, you know, they shouldn't run theory as a voter, or if they do, they should suffer the consequences for bad theory. But it can't be an RBI if it was not a voter issue originally. But also, like, you guys just never give a warrant for why it's an RBI. Like, the initial, well, you sort of give a warrant in the rebuttals, but in the constructives, you just say, theory is an RBI, moving on. And that's just clearly not enough. And so going to the extensions out of the neg block, I was pretty close to dropping you, like not giving you the topicality argument. But then in your rebuttal, you just don't answer like any specific logic that they put in their block explanation. The only thing you say is they were able to debate under this, so it's fine, and screw them for running theory because we lose education. But like for me, when they're telling me that you're not debating the resolution, like the fact that they were able to debate under this, the only thing that means is that they have ground, right? But their argument was not that they were losing ground. Their argument was just, it's like straight up not topical. And so you're not refuting the standard or quasi-standard they're actually using. And so I'm giving them the topicality argument. I'm not giving it to them as like a theoretical voter issue. I'm just giving it to them as arguments that don't link to this are not going to work. But given that you don't have arguments about wealth tax, it just means that you don't have offense. So I do end up voting on T, however reluctantly. And that means I'm voting neg.
Okay. Oh yeah, I voted, well, see, I don't buy your T argument because I don't see voters on it well enough, basically. I also think Arm's very right that what you guys are, your standards are that it's not topical, and that needs to be a lot clearer, like, because you did say fairness, like you threw that in there, but then, yeah, so it really needs to be clear that it's the non-topical. What ended up, I did not necessarily vote on your last speech because I think it's abusive to make that with many good arguments in the last speech. My flow basically came down to that there's going to be a loss, and that there's going to be cap flight and decreased jobs, and that you guys have increased growth in consumer spending, and that the growth in consumer spending will probably be better for the economy than the potential loss of jobs from a few companies moving out. So that's weighed that as larger magnitude, essentially. Yeah.
Oh yeah, Yeah, I think I mostly agree with case logic, like on the case debate. So then it was just theory where we differed.
Okay. Thank you for
Learn.
your
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, if you're gonna do research, like learn stuff about taxes. It helps a lot with like when you have to pull. We're gonna tax this, and it's gonna fund this program, which is like almost every debate. So. Thank you.
Thank you for your time.
Yeah. How do I turn this off?